I want to first welcome everyone to New America Foundation. I am Michael Cohen. I'm a senior research fellow here at New America, where I run the Privatization of Foreign Policy Initiative. And I just want to also mention that this meeting is being webcast, so those of you watching online, welcome as well. A couple days ago, Stephen Walt, professor at Harvard, had a rather amusing, sort of interesting piece on his blog that laid out the 10 commandments for ambitious policy wonks and what they should and should not say to get ahead in Washington. I'm pleased to note here that here at New America, we violate several of these commandments on a regular basis. In particular, commandment number 5, thou shalt not call for accommodation with Cuba or North Korea or Iran. I think Patrick is here. I think he's partly responsible for that. This may also, by the way, explain why so many of us in New America are 6 months into a new presidential administration, still working at New America. But I digress. The larger point, I think, raised by Walt's piece should be of concern to all of us who spend our days thinking and writing about U.S. foreign policy in the 21st century. Too often, the sacred cows, or the so-called sort of Washington consensus that defines how we talk about foreign policy, the role of the military, and America's place in the world rarely gets questioned. Impolite queries about the limitations of American power and the efficacy of military force are all too rarely asked. That's why I reached out to Chris and asked him if I could convene an event here at New America to help him sell and promote his book, The Power Problem. It's not just that I like Chris, and I do, and I did enjoy his book also, but I think Chris is asking precisely the sort of questions about American foreign and security policy that our current circumstances demand. Indeed, if Stephen Walt were to expand his list of things that thou shalt not say, he might want to read The Power Problem, Chris's book, and consider some of the issues that Chris raises. Does America's military dominance not strengthen but in fact weaken America? Is America's military too big? And does it lead policymakers to overreach and plunge themselves into unwise military interventions? Does America define its national interest too broadly and let other countries free ride off of American military and political largesse? Is U.S. military domination actually corrosive to American democracy? In the wake of the Iraq War and the possibly heightened and drawn-out military intervention in Afghanistan, these questions are perhaps more relevant than ever. On the campaign trail, candidate Obama noted that he wasn't just trying to end the war in Iraq, but he said we have to get out of the mindset that led us into Iraq. Well, if President Obama is going to be successful in that endeavor, then a public discussion on America's vital interests and the sort of foreign policy and force posture that furthers that interests must be held. Long-held assumptions must be examined, occasionally uncomfortable questions must be asked, and the public discourse must be broadened to include a whole host of new voices, including those at this table. So with that in mind, I'd like to begin one of those discussions. And I'm honored to be joined by a really distinguished group of foreign policy thinkers here. On the far right, we have Michael Lind, who is a colleague, a senior fellow here at New America Foundation. He's policy director of New America's Economic Growth Program, and author of The American Way of Strategy, U.S. Foreign Policy and the American Way of Life, and also with Ted Halstead, The Radical Center, The Future of American Politics, among other books. And he has been an editor or staff writer for The New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, The New Republic, and he is a frequent commentator on foreign policy and domestic policy issues. Next name is Gordon Adams, a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center, professor of U.S. foreign policy at my alma mater, American University, previously fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, as well as professor and director of security policy studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs. He's also served at International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Council on Foreign Relations. And finally, our guest of honor here, Chris Preble, director of Foreign Policy Studies at Cato Institute, author of The Power Problem, and also Exiting Iraq, How the U.S. Must End the Occupation and Renew the War Against al-Qaeda, and also John F. Kennedy and the Missile Gap. Before joining Cato, he taught history at St. Cloud State University and Temple University, and he is a commissioned officer in the U.S. Navy and a Gulf War veteran. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Chris and take it away.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you for inviting me to speak at New America. Thanks to Gordon and Mike Lind for agreeing to comment. It is a distinguished panel. I only hope I can hold up my end of the bargain. I should also say just a word about my second favorite think tank in Washington. New America Foundation has just an outstanding team on particularly on foreign policy, national security issues, and they defy all the neat, tidy ideological boxes, and that's a good thing. We need more of that. In fact, in terms of neat ideological boxes, I, of course, am regularly misidentified as a conservative. I spend a lot of time with self-described progressives, even though they don't really know quite what to make of me. These ideological labels are really problematic, particularly, I think, when it comes to foreign policy, because, if we're going to reorient our policies, and I think we need to do that, it must be nonpartisan or bipartisan, whatever word you want to use, in order to mobilize a constituency that to date has been largely quiescent. If we got past the partisan labels and look at our grand strategy that's been more or less constant over the last 20 years or so. It was crafted under a Republican administration, George H.W. Bush. It was adapted by a Democrat, Bill Clinton, deployed with some important modifications by George W. Bush, and now continues, I argue, under Democrat Barack Obama. Now, that's not to dispute there are some real differences, because there are, but the underlying presumption that has driven U.S. foreign policy for the last 2 decades has not changed. Republicans and Democrats here in Washington believe that the United States must act as the linchpin of the international order, that our global economic interests require the forward deployment of U.S. military to the 4 corners of the globe, and that we have an obligation to spread the blessings of liberty to people denied basic human rights. Well, I think we need a different approach, one with a greater appreciation for the purpose of our power and the limits of our power. The thesis of my book is simply stated, but I hope not simplistic. Our military power costs too much. It costs too much because we use it too much. And our too frequent use of this power engenders additional risks and ultimately undermines our security. In short, our power is a problem, and we should reduce our power in order to be more secure. Counterintuitive, I know, but hopefully over the next few minutes I can explain how this all works. I'm going to focus in particular today on 2 related subjects from the book. The first is the cost. The enormous size of the U.S. military crowds out other, more constructive forms of spending, both private and public. We must apply far more scrutiny to the top level of expenditures, the total amount that we spend on national security, and to all of the individual components, from research and development of individual weapon systems to our operational doctrines that drive day-to-day costs, to the number of men and women in uniform. The second point pertains especially to Michael Lynn's work, especially concerning the purpose of American military power and the criteria that we should use to shape our decision-making on whether to intervene militarily. In the book, I tackle both problems simultaneously, as I think we must. The ends and means of our current grand strategy do not align, and the gap is growing. The most important constraint on the means is the American people. They don't want to be the world's policeman. Washington, by and large, still does. Knowing this, the inside the Beltway crowd attempts to conceal the costs from the public, but it's growing harder and harder to do that. Instead of thinking that we can easily expand the means or even sustain the current level, I propose that we revisit our ends. So U.S. policymakers have maintained a dominant military posture, a global hegemony, whatever word you want to use, the undisputed power in every corner of the globe. And as noted, many Americans come to question these high costs and dubious benefits of this approach. But in fairness, even the defenders of our current grand strategy admit that it's costly and therefore deeply unpopular. Quote, "To make sacrifices largely for the benefit of others counts as charity," explains Michael Mandelbaum in his book The Case for Goliath, and for Americans, as for other people, charity begins at home. And polls show this over and over again, that Americans would far prefer a grand strategy that more equitably distributes the burdens of policing the world to the many beneficiaries of a peaceful and secure global order. But in fairness, scholars have noted this gap for some time, and many of the advocates for our current grand strategy, understanding this gap, they understand it really quite well. And here I'd quote from Mike Lynn's fine book, The American Way of Strategy. Mike correctly predicted, "It's all but certain the U.S. public confronted with a choice between slashing middle-class entitlements, dramatically raising taxes, and limiting military expenditures will force their elected leaders to limit military expenditures," unquote, which would effectively force our current hegemonic strategy to come crashing down. It's precisely for this reason that the political class has avoided confronting the American people with such stark choices. Mandelbaum predicts, with perhaps too much candor, quote, "The American role in the world may depend in part on Americans not scrutinizing it too closely. Well, humbly, this book is about scrutinizing it far more closely than we have. In other words, the foreign policy that we have, the disconnect between what the public wants and what policymakers give them, is deliberate and by design. You see, most of the people in Washington, maybe some of the people in this room, dismiss public attitudes as misinformed at best, isolationist at worst. While I agree we should not conduct foreign policy on the basis of polls and focus groups, in the grand scheme, the hand-waving and misdirection that our leaders have employed since the end of the Cold War to conceal the true costs of our current grand strategy is, well, unseemly. Actually, Michael Lind has a better word for it. Nothing could be more repugnant to America's traditions as a democratic republic, he writes, than a grand strategy that can be sustained only if the very existence of the strategy is kept secret from the American people by their elected and appointed leaders. Well, I wholeheartedly agree. In a country which presumes some measure of popular consent, the current pattern is repugnant. If this term strikes you as too strong, I would hope that you would at least concede that it is not realistic to expect it to continue indefinitely. The advocates for our present course like to point out the total share of economic output dedicated to defense is roughly equal to what we spent during the Cold War and imply, sometimes openly assert, that the economy could sustain much more, maybe even 6 or 8% of GDP as opposed to the 4.5% that we're spending today. But when one talks about what is sustainable, it's not enough to talk about what we can spend, what the economy could bear. We must also account for what the people will tolerate, and more importantly still, what makes sense for us to spend. Not what we can, but what we should. Well, let me dwell for a minute on what some people have called our gift to the world, our grand strategy, our hegemony. This gift requires, obviously, a vast military. You know, the number that I like to use is about $800 billion when you take account of all the various things that could be loosely characterized as national security spending, including, of course, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That works out to about $2,600 per every man, woman, and child in the United States. So I asked the question in the book, why do we spend so much? We've chosen to do so because our own security is not really at stake in most cases, but rather because we fear that other countries might come under threat, that entire regions might collapse into chaos were it not for the U.S. military presence. And this strategy, in other words, is driven more by our fear of arms races in East Asia and the Middle East than by concerns over the long-term cost of our military spending. In an earlier era, an eminently respected man worried about these long-term costs. Some might say he obsessed over them. Dwight David Eisenhower sought to strike a new balance between military needs and the capabilities of the domestic economy. In his famous Chance for Peace speech, which Mike also quotes in his book, Eisenhower explained the trade-offs inherent in the budding arms race. Every gun that is... I won't read it. We know it. Every gun that is made, every warship launched. Eisenhower also... He was trying to point to the diversion of people's talents and attention away from peaceful pursuits, an intangible factor, a factor that people understand, but still intangible. And so in the same speech, Eisenhower went to some lengths to illustrate the cost in terms of the trade-offs of military spending. He compared the cost of contemporary military hardware, dollar for dollar, to other things valued by society. Well, the trade-offs today are even starker. The cost of military equipment and weapon systems have risen far faster than the cost of food, housing, schools, and roads. For example, whereas a bomber in 1953 cost the equivalent of a new school in 30 cities, we could today build at least 150 elementary schools for the cost of just one B-2. Ike's bomber cost as much as 50 miles of highway. Today's bomber could buy more than twice as much. Our newest fighter plane, the F-22, about which I've written a lot lately, costs about $350 million apiece. That's about 50 million bushels of wheat. A typical Arleigh Burke destroyer costs about $1 billion to build. With the same amount of money, we could buy nearly 6,000 single-family homes at the medium home price, $169,000. That would house about 24,000 people. Now, I like to quote those costs because they directly relate to Eisenhower's speech. But, there was another one that I like to fix on. My colleague, Jeremy Lott, and I wrote an article a couple years ago about the bridges to nowhere in Alaska. Now, let's remember, this is Senator John McCain railing against these bridges in Alaska going to nowhere. Of course, this is at the same time that John McCain was enthusiastically supporting the war in Iraq, which was costing at the time about $10 billion a month. In other words, 1 month's time in Iraq cost the equivalent of at least 44 $225 million bridges. That's just one mission in just one country. If you take the $800 billion that we spend on national security, that's 2,600 bridges. That's 6 new bridges in every congressional district. Now, the point I'd like to make, and that I make in more detail in my book, is that it's unlikely that we need that many new bridges, but presumably some of them would go somewhere. And here, I think, is where the Coalition for Change will surely part company, because while I might want to use this money in a particular way, Gordon and Michael and the rest of you, I suspect, will have likely different set of priorities. But the point is that we are facing a very well-organized and obviously motivated cadre of lobbyists and industry trade groups making the case for more military spending. And those of us who believe the military is already too expensive and could and should be reduced, we need to have what unites us define a coalition to beat back these spending programs, not the disagreements that divide us. So that's the costs. We don't just need a political strategy for tackling these enormous costs for our military. We also need a new grand strategy, which I've already alluded to. We need to bring some measure of rationality to what we spend and why we spend it. With a different strategy, we could make responsible reductions to the size and scope of the military, and we could do so even as we keep faith with our men and women in uniform. The alternatives are far worse, and not just for American taxpayers, but also for our troops. As I've already noted, we could continue our current grand strategy, but because that strategy doesn't enjoy popular support, the policymakers will continue to conceal the true costs and misrepresent the benefits. That's what they've been doing for nearly 2 decades, and who am I to say that they won't be able to continue this pattern? Still, it's repugnant. Or we could point to the promises we've made to our retirees and the soon to retire and declare that these promises take precedent over other forms of federal spending. This so-called mandatory spending rises. As it does, then discretionary spending will come down. And of course, the largest single item by far of the discretionary budget is DOD. Well, I don't want that either, to be honest with you, because to dramatically reduce the amount of money going to the Pentagon without fundamentally reordering that which we ask our military to do would be worse than doing nothing. I would not support such an approach. In fact, I would fight it. And not merely because I once, briefly, wore a uniform, and not because a number of my friends still do. A just society pays for the things it values. An unjust society burdens the few with the demands of the many. So we should drive towards a new global order. My grand strategy would look upon other countries to assume full responsibility first for their own defense, and ultimately for dealing with regional security challenges before they become global challenges. Only by constraining our military power, however, can we precipitate such an equitable distribution of the risk and responsibilities across the international system. The process will not be easy. I am not naive. Other countries will resist because, after all, the current system does benefit them. And resistance will also come from inside the United States, and not just from the people who benefit directly from military spending, but also from that cadre of Americans who are enamored with the idea that we can and should and will continue to dominate the global order. But it's not easy, and it's not without risk, but the risks can be mitigated of making this transition if we establish clear and stringent guidelines concerning when and whether to use force. I put forward 4, 5, depending on how you count them, criteria to guide when and whether to use force. They are, whoa, I skipped ahead, look at that. They are national security interest at stake. Are they? If they are, then it makes sense to do so. Public support for the mission, ideally public support that's communicated through Congress, as the founders intended. That is, a declaration of war, which we haven't had since World War II, officially. An assessment, an accurate assessment of the likely costs of the war. Fourth, we should understand what the military mission is and therefore have an equally clear understanding of when the military mission will end. And finally, of course, we have to understand that force is a last resort. Civilized societies abhor warfare, and that's still the case today. We need these criteria, I contend, because unless we limit and come up with some set of criteria to limit how we use force, there will always be an impulse, a very powerful impulse here in Washington to do something. There is always that impulse, not just on foreign policy, I should point out. So in this political environment where there are so many calling for action and so few of us calling for restraint, it's only a matter of time before someone comes to General Petraeus or Admiral Mullen and say, what's the point of this superb military you're always talking about if we can't use it? That's what Madeleine Albright said famously to Colin Powell. Now, Powell at the time reported in his memoirs that he nearly had an aneurysm when Albright posed this question, and that's hardly surprising because he worried that a superb military that he had helped to create would be turned into a hollow force chasing too many missions with too few troops. He also resented, and I share this resentment, the presumption that American GIs were merely toy soldiers to be moved around some global game board. He would have preferred a set of criteria promulgated by a gentleman who he worked for in 1984, Caspar Weinberger. We now know it as the Weinberger-Powell Doctrine. I also highly recommend Michael's just completed article for the World Politics Review on the Powell Doctrine. My criteria are similar to the Powell Doctrine. We can talk about whether or not they are too stringent, not stringent enough. I suspect many people will find them too constricting, too narrow, and that's fine. I say, give me some criteria. Give me something. Give me anything. Because as I see it right now, the criteria we have are not very well understood, and they're not nearly stringent enough. My concern, again, is that if we restrain military spending without reshaping how we intend to use these forces, then the burdens will fall disproportionately on our men and women in uniform, and I don't think that's fair. In the end, this book argues that we must choose to change. You know, there is an international relations theory, this notion of balancing behavior, and that others will push us off our pedestal. I don't know that that's really true. We must choose to change. Others won't force us down, or if they do, we won't much like the way it plays out. And I'm confident that we can change, but realistic enough to know that it won't be easy. And we also need the right kind of change, because just because the American people want change doesn't tell us much about what change we're likely to get, or even if it will be an improvement. And let's be honest, I'm not so much of a populist that I will declare at the outset that whatever the American people want would necessarily be an improvement over what we have today. For example, I believe that I believe that a purely populist foreign policy is likely to be characterized by hostility to trade, trade and immigration, and that would not be an improvement. So that's why I go to some lengths in the book to make the case for global engagement, to make a positive case and to spell out what that entails. We must convince Americans that we can and should be globally engaged, but that such engagement need not take the form of a massive, costly military deployed around the world. We must explain the benefits of global trade and openness and being true to our principles. And we must believe in our principles enough such that we do not presume they must be imposed on others by force. Let me conclude with two of my favorite speeches, in addition to the Eisenhower speeches that I've already quoted. Washington in his farewell address and Jefferson in his first inaugural both admonished their countrymen to steer clear of the internal affairs of foreign powers, and they were anxious for the United States to avoid unnecessary wars. But that does not mean they didn't care about human rights and the plight of others. On the contrary, they cared deeply. Their concern was that by maintaining their nation as a shining example and serving as a beacon for the world, that would advance the cause that they fought to achieve. Well, you know, two of the leading advocates of our current grand strategy over 12 years ago now, William Crystal and Robert Kagan, scorned such a vision as synonymous with, quote, cowardice and dishonor, unquote. But at the end of the day, I ask, why should we listen to these two men and their cohort who have set this country on such a ruinous course for the past decade? We can see how their strategy has sapped our strength and undermined our security. And we can see, perhaps more clearly now than at any time since the end of the Cold War, that we would be richer, freer, and safer if we adhered more closely to the vision that our founders set for us. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask Gordon and Michael to respond, but I'll just say, as I said in my opening, the goal here was to begin the process of possibly slaying some sacred cows, and I think I can say, to quote a former president, mission accomplished. With that in mind.
A little shake of the shoulders there.
Yeah, exactly. I will let Gordon, if you could, take the first crack at this.
All right, first crack. The first question I have to ask, in some areas, as Chris knows, he will find me in violent agreement with what he has to say, which could make for a very uninteresting discussion if I agreed with everything, and I don't, fortunately. Otherwise, why be here? The first question I wanted to raise, though, it occurred to me as I was listening to Chris talk, is why are we not having in Washington, D.C. the kind of debate that he is suggesting? Because we aren't. This debate is not being had. These issues aren't being raised. They aren't being discussed in the press. They aren't a feature of the Quadrennial Defense Review. They aren't a feature, as far as I know, of the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review that Secretary Clinton announced. God knows what's happening to the National Security Council's review because it keeps getting postponed and nobody quite knows what it is, except that the first draft was pretty anodyne. Shock gasp for anybody who's ever worked in Washington that the NSC should come out with a national strategy that's fairly superficial and anodyne. But we're not having this debate. We don't have a lot of debates in this town. As I was listening, I was struck by the fact that we're not having a debate about single payer on health care either. It's just not on the table. There are a lot of options that are not on the table, and I keep waiting for the ad that says, "Would you put an insurance company between you and your doctor?" Haven't seen that ad yet. Hasn't appeared. People are more worried about putting government between me and my doctor than they are about the insurance company. I'm more worried about the insurance company. I cite it only to point out that there are certain debates that don't get had in Washington, D.C. I do agree with an awful lot of what Chris has written in this book. And I think it's extraordinarily valuable. And there is a flow of thinking and writing. Michael Lind's part of it. Andy Basovich is part of it. John Mueller is part of it, who are writing and thinking about national security issues and foreign policy issues in a very different language, in a very different frame, if I dare use the term, than the standard debate that we have in Washington, D.C. So let me, first off, stipulate just some areas where I think, by and large, we agree. The military of the United States is way too big and way overused. In fact, I would go even further. I would say we are obsessed with the military in Washington, D.C. We are obsessed with the defense culture, and I hold myself as guilty as anybody else over the past 20 years of my life as being obsessed with the military culture, the military role and mission, the future of military equipment, the debates about the role of force, the debates about the size of the military. This becomes the template in which we discuss American national security and foreign policy all too often. In fact, I dare say, and this is a slight point of disagreement with Chris's book, even he is obsessed with the military. The language of the book, and even the language, Chris, of your talk, is still obsessed with the military. Is what's the military role? What's the military supposed to do? Should it be bigger? Should it be smaller? Should it engage? On what terms should it engage? Excuse me, fellows and ladies. The role of the United States in the world is a lot bigger than the role in the engagement of the United States military. But because we spend as much as Chris rightly points out we do, and because we are obsessed with the language of uniform military force and uniform military equipment and uniform military operations, we tend to view our entire international engagement in the framework of a debate about the roles and uses of military force. It's one of the reasons that I so value Andy Basovich's work, because Andy, who is also obsessed with the military, I might add, but writes a book saying this is a historic assumption of American national security policy. And we tend to view all of these debates through that lens and in that frame. And arguably, I say, even Chris's book is obsessed with it, and I'm going to come back to that. Secondly, and he says little about this, but I think it's an important underlying point because we are so obsessed about the terrorist threat. We have dramatically overstated the terrorist threat. We have dramatically overstated its impact on American national security and on our existential survival. We've dramatically overstated the degree to which that is the major challenge we confront globally. And it feeds right into the first obsession. And again, here I refer you to a really provocative book by John Mueller on the subject of our obsession with the terrorist threat that really makes one think about whether or not the entire industry of Washington, D.C. devoted to terrorism is really helpful in helping us address the kinds of challenges that Chris is talking about. Thirdly, we have a cowboy subculture. Chris has referred to it. It just really loves throwing our weight around. Bob Kagan's part of it. Irving Kristol's part of it. Charlie Krauthammer, who I simply can't read anymore, is part of it. John Bolton is part of it. Even Robert Kaplan, who you'd think would be a more unbiased observer, is obsessed with it. Michael Mandelbaum, and one could go on with a variety of people who think muscularity is the name of the game here. In fact, I dare say I would contrast most extremely where Chris is with Tom Barnett, who seems to me is totally obsessed with the capabilities of the American military, not only to police but to administer security around the globe. And I don't know if you would agree that that's fair, but I put you at the polls.
Thank you.
With Tom Barnett. Okay.
I like that.
And I thought you'd probably be pretty happy with that. I'm certainly happy with that. And we have, fourthly, and this comes to Chris's point of there not being so much discontinuity between Democrats and Republicans in administrations as some people think, we also have what I would bluntly describe as a sort of neo-imperial, exceptional nation, indispensable nation subculture. Call it liberal internationalism, if you will, and you can put Powell there, Albright there, Clinton there, other people you know well in the room, Ivo Daalder. I mean, you can run through a number of people who basically say we have this glorious liberal exceptionalist international mission that still requires a large amount of military power in order to ensure that we can play that role. Fundamentally, we too often think we know better. We know more, and we know better. And I'm as guilty in that club as some others in terms of what I've written. Fifth point, through the Cold War, and I could quibble with some of Chris's data and what its importance about the size and costs of military force, but we have built a tool which we now rely on to execute too much of our policy and to shape too much of our policy, and there is a vigorous constituency saying it ain't enough. My view is if you can't defend the security of the United States for $684 billion, shame on you, get another job. But the argument is that there's not enough, and you will see that the normal, courageous, upright, independent Senate of the United States just voted yesterday to authorize the administration to add another 30,000 to the ground forces of the United States because we simply haven't got enough, and to pay for it by either asking for a supplemental or adding it to the budget the next time around. Now, full disclosure, Chris and I actually wrote a piece together on this subject about 2.5 years ago.
Obviously didn't take.
Which obviously didn't take, right? About why it wasn't necessary to add the first 97,500 people to the Army and the Marine Corps in terms of the American ground force. But as long as we're marching down the road of asking them to do stabilization, to impose democracy by force, to do nation building, to conduct counter-terrorist operations, to fight insurgents around the world, I'm still a little mystified as to where all those insurgents are. But that said, that's the mission that we've laid out. And indeed, if you go down that path, there is a technically arguable case that says we need more. There's no question. But, okay, and let me transition to the but. The world that we're living in is not the world of the founders of the United States of America. And Chris's book has a lot of adref to Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and a bunch of other people, and he's a wonderful scholar of that stuff, so I'm not criticizing it. But especially internationally, this ain't the world they lived in. And so that's a dilemma for me. Secondly, we live, this is going to stagger you, but if you look at the data, we live in a world largely at peace. Oh my God. There's a skeptical thought that doesn't penetrate the barons of the Washington media or the barons of Washington think tanks very often, but in fact, in terms of the incidence of combat, the incidence of terrorism, the incidence of major conflict, we're in an unusually peaceful time in the world, as much as we may focus on specific instances of conflict. Thirdly, we live in a world that is highly interdependent. This was significantly less true in the founders' era than it is today, but I don't need to go into the data from almost any way you measure it. This is an immensely interdependent world, including the interdependence of the United States. And we have globally a series of dilemmas or challenges or opportunities or problems that need to be dealt with. I need only refer you to the pages that deal of the Financial Times that deal with the global economy, issues of failed state and governance, issues of identity and identity conflict, not to speak of all the transnational agenda of issues that we have to deal with. The key to this interdependent set of countries and interdependent set of challenges, some of which are transnational, is they have two characteristics that I find quite compelling. One is, regardless of where you locate it, they demand a civilian response. They don't demand a military response as much as they demand a civilian response. And secondly, they are a set of dilemmas and issues that the United States simply cannot deal with alone and shouldn't try. So that civilian multilateral character of the interdependent world we live in is a kind of the lodestar that drives me, which will make some disagreements with where Chris is coming from. And so where I disagree with Chris is in the area of prescription. Not fully, because from the point of view of the military, I think it's absolutely important to ramp down the size of the United States military. I'll stipulate that. But in a way, I look at Chris's book and I find it very curiously an 18th century turn of mind. How would I say this? I'm looking for a word. Just libertarian kind of comes to mind. I'm not quite sure why. It has a very nice ring to it.
I've heard that.
Right? A sort of libertarian view of the world. With no particular answer in the book to the dilemmas or challenges or opportunities that I've described, except let the neighbors do it. Probably not good enough. But that to me means there's not much here about what the civilian toolkit needs to look like, not only here, but internationally. In fact, by coming at an obsessed military frame, as we all too often do, we fly past civilian capabilities real fast in this book. And in general, I think, in the discussion. And when we fly past them, we're raising some very serious dilemmas, because the debate that they are having out there in the virtual universe of Washington, which is not the real debate that we're having here, in the virtual universe of Washington, the debate is how do I build enough civilian capacity so that when I deploy all this large force that Chris is talking about, I can deploy some civilians alongside it so they can take care of what they couldn't do in Iraq and Afghanistan: govern, reconstruct, handle social problems, build rule of law, nation build. And so there's a terrorism cottage industry in Washington. There's a stabilization reconstruction cottage industry in Washington that is busy arguing that we need to build 5, 10, 15,000, says the NDU in a study that I confess I contributed a chapter to, but I did tell the author I disagreed with his premise, which was that we needed 15,000 people to deploy civilians alongside of America's military abroad. Well, that's one frame. That's a particular problem you think you want to solve. You deploy the military, need some civilian people to build for it, because we can't ask the military to be the nation builders. The alternative perspective is, what kind of a civilian toolkit and set of missions and set of strategies do we need, national and multilateral, to address the agenda of problems that I have, one small piece of which might be a military capability? You get a very different answer, I think, to the question if you change the frame. But we don't have enough here on that. There is, as I said, no recognition here, I think, of the interdependent and increasingly multilateral world that we live in. There's rhetoric here, Chris, about public and private responses. That's all good, and it is a public-private, and I would add an international or multilateral set of activities. They're going on, folks. We don't hear much about them. We all hear about how we're obsessed with deploying the military. But there's not a recognition here, and I think for the purposes of arguing his case, he needs to say, well, what's the foreign policy objective? Not what's the military objective, but what's the foreign policy objective? And is that realizable? And is it good enough to fill in the blank with let the neighbors do it? Or is there an alternative here? A fifth area of difference, if you will, is, and you referred a little more to it, Chris, when you talked, is getting from here to there. I mean, having built this entire architecture of how we engage the world, to simply say, let the water out of the tub, I'm pulling the plug, is a kind of a blunt instrument. So talking about how one would get from here to a less militarized form of engagement, I would say my words, not yours, right, is important. A sixth question, this is just a question that I came up as I read the book, and I have a bias in my answer, but does having a large military increase our propensity to intervene, which is something you do say in the book? Or does our propensity to intervene drive us to have a large military?
Right.
I think one has to address that question and say which is the chicken and which is the egg, or what's the relationship between the chicken and the egg here. Which brings me to the criteria for the use of force. I think that's really worth talking about because I couldn't disagree too strongly with his criteria. I'm not even sure Cap Weinberger could disagree too strongly with his criteria. But I'm not sure what should come out with different sized forces and different answers about use,
right,
despite the criteria.
Right.
Is it clear enough? And within the framework of those criteria, as you say, I think on page 167, what is the military capability that is right if the goal, as you say, is to, quote, prevent a threat? Right. Mm-hmm. I think, Charlie Krauthammer, Bill Kristol would prevent a threat with a different sized force than you would prevent a threat with, and they have a different language for talking about it. And then one sort of point of detail where I kind of think is the linchpin of having this, if you're going to be obsessed with the military, the linchpin within the military for dealing with your set of options or mine is the size of the Army. Mm-hmm. It really comes down to that. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's about the size of the Navy, and you like a fairly muscular Navy, smaller than it is now, and I agree, mm-hmm, but it has a role. I don't think we disagree too much on the size of the Air Force, which is shrinking anyway because we just can't buy enough of those aircraft. The key here is historically the difference. If you want to go back to the founders, Washington, Jefferson, those people had no difficulty shrinking the ground boots force. They did not see the wisdom of maintaining a large American ground force. And we followed that precept, that's not just the founders, right up to the Second World War. And what happened after the Second World War, and especially after Korea, was we built a huge standing ground force. And we're still juggling a huge standing ground force. And my point of view, just speaking strictly about the military issue, which is why we wrote that piece, is the size of the ground force is a key driver of this entire view of the military's mission. Absolutely critical. And we are now, I hope, going to have a debate. Well, it's not clear that we will, but the boots on the ground issue is what's driving Senator Lieberman and the centrist hawks and so on to add forces to the ground forces of the United States. And from their point, it's mission-driven, but that's what it's about. It's about, technically, the size of the ground force. So those are, I went on a little bit too long, I'm sorry, but those are sort of major areas of agreement, transition, some areas of disagreement.
Thank you. Michael?
Well, let me begin by saying that I own a small ranch in Texas and will inherit another one, and so I take exception to Gordon's description of the neocons as a cowboy subculture. In fact, trying to picture the neocons anywhere near cows and horses, except on a dude ranch, maybe, which might build character and make them better people, for all I know.
It's real world.
Like Gordon, I agree with much of Chris's analysis, which I always profit from, and we don't necessarily come to the same conclusions. I'm considerably more hawkish and more interventionist, I think, than Chris, and possibly even Gordon in some ways. But I think the interesting thing is the fact that you get interesting debates when you reason from the same premises and then debate about how they're applied, as opposed to the usual Washington thing where people agree on a policy and they have 15 separate incompatible reasons for that policy and their coalition just breaks down on anything else. So I'm going to concentrate my remarks on trying to expand and flesh out the critique you've heard, by actually naming some countries. I think the key to the Washington Consensus, and the reason why I accused the foreign policy establishment of essentially not being honest to the American people, is because, for quite understandable diplomatic reasons, no one anywhere near power in the United States wants to speak the truth about the real purpose of American national security policy of the last half century, for fear of offending the most powerful other countries in the world. And let me just give you my interpretation of this, which and I'll cite some of the authorities from the foreign policy establishment itself, like Michael Mandelbaum, who've broken the rule, broken the taboo, and made explicit what is usually left unsaid. I think if you look at both our national security policy and our global economic strategy, and there is one, these two things are not completely unrelated, even though they're usually discussed as though they're on separate planets. You can understand both by referring to four countries, which happen to be the other four great powers or greatest powers: Germany, Japan, Russia, and China. You can't understand our national security strategy or our trade policies without thinking about these countries in particular. First, our national security strategy. As many people have pointed out, this is simply the standard interpretation. Our foreign policy during the Cold War was one of dual containment. We were containing four countries, not just two. We weren't just containing the Soviet Union and Communist China, but we were also containing post-1945 Germany, West Germany, and post-1945 Japan. And the reason the U.S. adopted this hegemonic global military strategy, which was not what it had intended in World War II. Mm-hmm. In the course of World War II, the Roosevelt administration in its planning assumed you would have a three-power world, essentially the British, the Soviets, and the Americans, and that Chiang Kai-shek would govern China as a satellite of the Americans. But in the Cold War, this all broke down. And what evolved was a system in which the Germans and Japanese would be permanently demilitarized. Their security would be provided unilaterally by the United States. I mean, we would call it NATO, but it would essentially be a unilateral offer of guarantee for this disarmed Japan and this disarmed West Germany. At the same time, the Soviet Union and China, which late in the Cold War became a geopolitical ally of the U.S., would be contained. They would be outside of the system. And you would be protecting Japan and Germany, Japan from both China and the Soviet Union, Germany from the Soviet Union. Now, what does that have to do with economics? Well, there was a deal implicit in this strategy, which is, okay, Germany and Japan, you have this massive military-industrial complex. We unlike after World War I, we're not going to have punitive reparations and so on to bring about some future Hitler as a result of humiliation. Well, we want to rebuild you and integrate you into this American-led system, including a global free trade system or managed trade system. So the deal is, you don't make tanks, you make cars. You don't make guns, you make radios. So you will become civilian manufacturing superpowers, and this is in the interest of the United States, at least according to American strategists, because this will avert the reemergence of an independent Japanese military great power and an independent, even West German military great power, in the emergence of a multipolar world with multipolar rivalries like those of the 1930s. So the deal, which was taken up more by Japan than by West Germany, which has had fairly liberal trade relationships both with us and with its neighbors in Europe, was that you export to us, and we will turn a blind eye to the fact that you, Japan, use non-tariff barriers to keep our products out of your market, to the fact that you're targeting particular industries in the U.S., to the fact that you're hiring lobbyists in Washington, to promote your industrial strategy in the 70s and 80s. We will turn a blind eye because we're willing to sacrifice certain American industries, and here the libertarians, apart from my interpretation, we will sacrifice certain American industries in order to keep you part of the U.S. Cold War coalition. And we will tolerate things that if we were not military allies and protectors, we would never put up with. And so that was, basically the pattern. Now, the end of the Cold War comes along. There was a Fascinating debate. I was sort of on the sidelines of it as executive editor of the National Interest back. Irving Kristol's Foreign Policy magazine, by the way, back in the early 1990s, late 1980s. And you had the America First isolationists. You had the Balance of Power School. There were the liberal internationalists. And so it was a fascinating debate. It was all shut down in the aftermath of the Gulf War, and we've had the de facto basic same strategy under both Clinton and Bush, and now under Obama, with the exception of the more aggressive neoconservative slant. And the decision was made. It sort of evolved. It's not a conspiratorial thing, but this became the new consensus after the Gulf War in 1991. The decision was made: we will continue the policy of dual containment. In other words, we're not going to rethink it. We're not going to say, okay, NATO, we're going to admit the Russians and turn it into a concert of power. We're going to get rid of it. We're going to come up with a new system and bring in the Chinese. No, basically, we will continue to be Japan's protector in Asia and South Korea's. We will maintain these Cold War alliances, and we will maintain NATO, which will be expanded for fear. And I'm simply reporting, I'm not endorsing this, because I agree, I think, with everyone on this panel that a certain paranoia has driven a lot of this, for fear that after reunification, Germany would emerge as a Fourth Reich, this sort of loose cannon, neo-militaristic power. And so the geostrategic purpose of the expansion of NATO, it served both of the goals of dual containment after the Gulf War. You push NATO all the way up to the borders of a weakened post-imperial Russia, so you're still containing Russia, no longer the Soviet Union, but the Russian Republic. And at the same time, you've embedded Germany even more deeply in this system of U.S. alliances, of hegemonic alliances. And they're not it's not a traditional alliance system. Traditional alliance system was like the Allies in World War I, World War II, right? And it's something Chris favors. I think there are problems when there's enormous inequality between the partners, but the American alliance system is a hegemonic system. We expect nothing really in return from. They're essentially client states and protectorates. Most of our so-called allies, they're not actual equal partners. We will protect them for what we perceive as our interest in a world order that's beneficial to us. They really don't have to do anything in return, protect us. But we don't see this as charity, at least the establishment. Right. This is promoting a world order. Okay, so we maintain this dual containment system after the Cold War. Paul Wolfowitz and others had a name for it in the early 1990s, some of you may recall from stories in the New York Times and elsewhere. It was called reassurance. That was the initial, during the first Bush administration. This was called the reassurance doctrine. We would reassure the other great powers of the world that because we would look after their geopolitical interests, they would not need to rearm. And they could continue to devote their economic energy. In fact, George W. Bush said this at West Point in 2003. Yeah. He said, the other countries should concentrate basically on trade, right? And we will maintain these, enormous strengths.
Go shopping at the mall.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But my point is, this is not a crazy idea. I think all of us would agree. This is flawed and ultimately doomed. But there is a system here. And that brings me, in my final point in analyzing this consensus system to the economic counterpart, which has evolved since the Gulf War. And this is a system which people call Bretton Woods II. Bretton Woods II is the term that economists use for this very strange global economic order that evolved in the last 20 years, in which the American consumers went into debt in order to purchase goods from primarily China. China has, at least up until the crash, 90% of the non-oil trade deficit with the United States. But even before China moved up in this decade, it was East Asian countries, to a lesser extent Germany and Europe. So you get this very odd system where the United States is the consumer market of first resort for the other three leading market or quasi-market economies in the world, which today are Japan, China, and Germany. Japan, China, and Germany all have substantial merchandise trade surpluses. The United States has had an ever-growing merchandise trade surplus. And when you read these discussions taking place on economy planet and national security planet with no reference, to the bargain here, it's just kind of missing the point. There was a geopolitical bargain underlying America's offer of unilateral access to U.S. markets, particularly to Japan, which practiced a fairly sophisticated form of mercantilism at the expense of U.S. exports. And then after the Cold War, the elites in the United States decided to extend this to China. Okay, so this brings us up to the present and why this system is collapsing before our eyes. What worked for Japan, a country much smaller than the United States, they could trade with us while protecting their markets from American exports. This cannot work. That export-oriented model was doomed the moment China, the world's most populous nation, adopted it. There are simply not enough first-world consumers in the U.S. or the U.S. and EU and Japan put together to accommodate all of the stuff that first China and now India are capable of doing. So this, in that sense, this bargain was doomed. And this is one of the underlying reasons for this crash, because if China would not have had these enormous dollar surpluses, so some of the oil exporting countries would have, but China would not have, had a more demand-oriented, domestic consumption-driven policy. It was this export-oriented policy that allowed it to accumulate these dollar surpluses, and indirectly through purchasing American debt for reasons we need not get into, but that also helped their exports, enabling American consumers to go on this binge, which then helped build up what is really gross overcapacity in Chinese manufacturing, far too much capacity. So this system has crashed now. It's not coming back. Now, if the economy recovers to a certain extent, yes, U.S. may import a little bit more, the Chinese may export a little bit more, but it's run into its limits. So Bretton Woods, too, is dead as a global economic system. You simply, there is no other domestic consumer market apart from the U.S. that is capable of accommodating all of the export capacity, not only of China, but of Germany and even of Japan, but even of Germany, which has trade surpluses with all of its European neighbors. So how does this affect the security policy? Well, my prediction is that the costs of digging our way out of this collapsed 1990s, 2000s, post-1992 global economic system, which again was rested on this geopolitical bargain between the U.S. and these potentially threatening great powers, except for Russia, which is becoming more and more of a resource power. But it was the other three major industrial great powers, China, Japan, and Germany. We're simply not going to be able to afford a military that's at 4 or 5%, particularly a military which had as its actual purpose, and let me wrap up just by saying this. The actual purpose, if you read Michael Mandelbaum, wrote a very good book, is setting forth what I think is kind of the establishment position. I recommend it to everybody if you want sort of a view from the inside.
As long as they promise to read your book and mine.
Our critiques of it and Gordon's work, and Michael's as well.
And mine as well, please. Thank you.
No, but he says, well, the real reason we have this giant military is not because we need all these aircraft carriers in order to prevent jihadists, from sneaking into the U.S. and getting on airplanes. We don't actually need this giant army, to deal with the North Koreans, or this or that rogue state. So rogue states and terrorists, which are real problems. I'm not diminishing this. I may take them more seriously than some of the other people here. I mean, they're problems. But that's not, if you look at the structure of our military, it is designed to intimidate China, Germany, and Japan, and Russia if they even think about rearming. That's why we have the size of the military, because it's grossly oversized if you actually want to fight jihadists in AFPAC. But when people come out and say, as President George W. Bush is, that's the purpose of our military, no one should even think about competing with our capabilities. Well, who's thinking about competing with the capabilities of the U.S. military? A bunch of guys in a suburb or a cave in Afghanistan, Pakistan? No. We know what the countries are, the ones that can never be named as objects of U.S. strategy: China, Russia, Germany, and Japan. So, I'll just end with a prediction. the collapse of Bretton Woods II is going to bring down this reassurance strategy, by creating a fiscal crisis for the American state, of which we're in the early stages because of the enormous debt from the bailout, combined with, if we avoid future bubbles, a fairly slow rate of growth. And this is going to create enormous political conflict in the United States. The defenders of the Pentagon, of whom I'm one in some, I don't want us to cut to dangerous levels, but there's going to be a battle between the Pentagon and the American Associations of Retired Persons over if we're going to cut government spending by 2 or 3%, is it going to come out of the Pentagon budget, or are we going to slash Social Security? And Medicare needs to be dealt with because of its cost inflation, but are we going to slash a reform Medicare? And so my money is on the old people.
It might be a self-interested argument in a few years, I think. I'm going to take a moderator's prerogative to both editorialize and ask a question, because I'm really struck by this debate about trade-offs. I actually do not live in Washington. I live in Brooklyn, which is a conscious decision on my part. So I was referring to people who did not have jobs in the administration. I was not referring to myself. And one of the advantages, I think, of living outside of Washington is that you sort of have maybe a different point of view on some of the debates that happen in this town. And I have really been struck by the current debate over health care in particular. We're arguing right now about spending $1 trillion to make sure that every American has access to health care. And we can't do this because we can't raise the revenue for it. We can't raise taxes and so on and so forth. By the way, a point that comes home to me even more so when I think my wife is a social worker and she works at a hospital in Brooklyn, and she just got email a couple months ago. So,
Woohoo.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Not a computer, mind you, but she got email. And yet, we spent $1 trillion fighting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It probably, those are just direct costs. The indirect costs are probably a great deal more. So the kind of discussions we have about trade-offs, we make them all the time on domestic policy issues. But when it comes to military issues, we almost never make these kind of conversations, discussions. As for my question, as Chris was nice enough to mention, I have a new piece out on the Powell doctrine. You can pick up a copy in the back when you depart. And one of the things I was working on that kind of struck me was that if you go back to, say, end of World War II, this country cut its military by about 90%, which was understandable considering that we had a draft and we had several million men in uniform. But we cut it so significantly. We cut it so significantly that by the time the Korean War came up, our military actually wasn't really probably equipped to fight that war. Then you go look at Vietnam, another example. After Vietnam, the response of the military in particular, and civilian policymakers like Weinberger, was to say, well, let's not do that again. Let's put more constraints on the use of military force before we get involved in another Vietnam-like conflict. What I find striking about this is that we've just somewhat, I suppose, completed what I would argue is the most strategically misguided military intervention in American history, by a long stretch, by the way, in Iraq. And yet, we've taken a quite opposite course that we did after World War II and Vietnam. In fact, we've taken a course of sort of doubling down. What I'm struck by in particular, and I've written this in the piece, is the lessons learned from Iraq have been, to date it seems, how do we fight these types of wars more effectively? As opposed to the lesson that I draw from it, which is, let's never do that again. Right. So I guess that's kind of my question. Why is it that we're not having that kind of discussion? Why is it that we're not saying, let's not do that again? And I guess that gets to sort of Gordon's question. How do we, if we're not having that discussion after the war in Iraq, are we ever going to have that discussion? And how do we get, as Gordon said, from here to there? And how do we go back to candidate Obama's comment? How do we change the mindset that got us into this war in the first place?
Well, thanks to everybody Michael, you really ended on an easy. That's the easy question, which is a similar question to what Gordon asked. It's like, why haven't we fixed this yet? As most of you know, I'm a historian by training, and history is the building block of policymaking, or at least it's one of them. It should be. The problem is that unlike the physical sciences, where when something occurs, it's easy to figure out what happens if I drop this bottle, it's going to hit the table. History is highly contingent, subjective, malleable, all of those things. After Vietnam, there were competing narratives about what happened in Vietnam, competing narratives that we continue to fight over to this day. Read the competing obituaries of Robert McNamara and his life. Compare and contrast that which was written in the Wall Street Journal with that which was written in the New York Times and the Washington Post. It's interesting reading. And so that's why I think we have not had a debate post-Iraq, is that the people who agree with you that the lesson should be don't do that again are vastly outnumbered in the policy community and in the kind of scholarly community by those who want to come up with some creative explanations. And as I think you know, I published a paper through Cato with Ben Friedman and Harvey Sapolsky on the lessons of Iraq, which tried to do this. But there have been other lessons of Iraq, Mike Mazar and others. Sure. So I think part of this is to get that material out to a wider audience and circumvent the kind of established media outlets that aren't particularly receptive to it. If I can just take one moment to respond, especially to Gordon's points. I am a libertarian, guilty as charged. No surprise there. And I think that when you talk about a civilian response to problems and the kinds of challenges that we're facing today that are not particularly conducive to military solutions, we agree. But you, I would think, must concede that we don't send agronomists or civil law experts or infectious disease experts or physicians or the other things, the other civilian capacity, the other civilians that you talk about. We do not send them into war zones. Or if we do, we send them into war zones heavily protected by guys who at the end of the day know how to pry a gun out of the cold, dead hand out of the person who would shoot the agronomist dead if they could, right? And that is why I have been, and my colleague Justin Logan and I have written on this at some length, have been very skeptical of the argument that civilian capacity can exist and go forward independent of, and to some extent at the expense of, military capacity, because I just don't think that's realistic. Where it plays out in, as the way related to Michael's comments, is that you have a civilian capacity in other countries, not the United States, that is heavily dependent upon the U.S. military providing that kind of security. Again, look at what the Germans are doing or not doing in Afghanistan. You know, we get what we reap what we sow, right? And I think it's all well and good to talk about civilian capacity, but we have to be aware and I think honest about what it would take to build out our civilian capacity in conflict zones. I think it would require a much larger military, and again, that's not where I want us to go. So,
do you want to comment?
A couple of comments that I have. First question is, why don't we have this debate? And I think part of the reason, there's a lot of reasons, and I think, Chris, you're right partly in the fact that there is just a preponderance of people who are circulating the debate who don't want to have this debate, and so it doesn't get the kind of airtime it needs to have. I think one of the dimensions is politics, and that's a lesson of Vietnam. It's a political lesson that the Democratic Party learned, and I think it's an unfortunate lesson. But it is nonetheless a lesson that a lot of the Democratic Party learned, which is if you don't look muscular for the military, you're not going to win the presidency or the Congress. And so the premium is put in the Democratic Party on muscularity, on the national security side. I had the good fortune in many respects of serving in the Clinton administration. And I remember how compelling a reasoning this was for the Clinton administration. That muscularity had to be part of the rhetoric in order to protect the flank of the Democratic Party from the accusations of that dialogue about Vietnam. You know, these were the people who lost Vietnam. This was the 1968 Chicago Convention, George McGovern candidacy people, right? And so those people protect themselves, I think, in part by this bravado about the use of military force and a focus on the military. It's, in a sense, it's very frustrating because it makes it very hard to have a reasonable discussion about the place of the military in American foreign policy inside the Democratic Party. That, I think, shuts off part of the debate here and affects the culture. And that's only one reason, but I think it's an important reason we didn't talk about. The other question is on civilian capacity. I think I'm saying something different from what you said I was saying. Okay, or maybe not. When you got to the words "in conflict zones," then I thought maybe we were talking about. You didn't hear what I was saying fully because you focused on in conflict zones, and maybe I didn't explain it clearly. But to me, there is a very different frame between saying what the United States should be developing as a civilian capability to deploy in conflict zones to take care of the stuff that we shouldn't be asking the military to do, which is one frame, and I don't agree with it. And the other frame, which is how do we frame American foreign policy so that we are using the civilian toolkit to deal with a particular set of issues, which is failing, fragile, post-conflict states, of which there are many still around the world, building in the assumption that that's not about the United States, A, intervening, B, governing, or doing it unilaterally. So what I was trying to focus on is there's a problem out there that I think your solution, which is let the neighbors do it, is inadequate for. It's very real. It can only be properly addressed multilaterally, but it's not particularly the problem of putting civilians in harm's way in conflict zones. Okay. Right? So the other point I was making earlier on in what I said was the number of conflict zones where that is an issue is really quite limited. And if we assume that Iraq and Afghanistan are what drive our thinking about this problem, then we're fighting what I call the last post-war. Right? That's not the capacity or the problem set even that I'm talking about. But I am talking about what I think is a real issue that is not only in the interests of American national security, but also of the regional countries and other powers, which is how do you deal with, and it's not an easy issue, the challenge of failing, fragile, weak governance in a zone of countries, if you will, that goes from the tip of Africa across through the Middle East and over into some parts of Asia. That's a global dilemma that we don't have an easy answer for, and I don't think we can solve alone. But it's not, I think you focused on a narrower subset, which is how do you put American agronomists in a conflict zone? You can only do that if you protect them with American soldiers. Yes, but that may not be the case that we're dealing with. That's the last post-war.
I just want to make a brief point about the discussion of capabilities. Don't our enemies read our debates? No, I think you have to factor that in. So, for example, if you say that after Vietnam or after Iraq, you say no more small wars, no more pacification. From now on, we'll just have World War II, Powell Doctrine type things against enemy armed forces. At that point, the enemies, and there are enemies, are then going to say, oh, okay, guerrilla warfare, right? They just said they're not going to fight counter-guerrilla warfare. If you say we will do only pacification and we will dismantle, our large-scale conventional forces, well, guess what? The bad guys are going to do. I mean, they're going to, ramp up tanks and, armored personnel carriers and planes and so on. So it just seems to me that as insurance, you want to have a range of capabilities. Now, you can't have everything because it will bankrupt you. I mean, you can't have a 2 million person army. So there are limits of the capabilities you can have, and in a way, other than that, I don't think absent a particular conflict, you can sort of say in advance we're going to do this kind of conflict, but not that. Now, I know that this may put me on the outlier here because after these very nasty counterinsurgency wars like Vietnam and Iraq, there is a tendency to say never again, we're never going to do this. and it will, we'll go. It'll be the Powell Doctrine, Weinberger Doctrine, whatever you want to call it, But then 5 years later, and even under a grand strategy, which some of us, if not everybody, might support, there might not be an army standing out there in the desert like Rommel's, nicely ready for Patton, to smash, right? I mean, they may be doing this through low-level warfare, right? So that's just, my caution about coming up with a tactical doctrine when you don't actually know what the situations may necessarily be.
Sure.
Just one comment on that. It's just a question, really. Both Vietnam and Iraq were wars we chose. They weren't wars that were imposed on us.
Well, neither was Korea.
Right. Korea was one that was imposed on us if we chose to fight it. But
that's not how the administration
we chose. But Vietnam was not Korea. I mean, these are insurgency wars. Those two insurgency situations were wars we chose to fight.
They saw it as look. I wrote a book on this, and it doesn't make me, my opinion authoritative. But the Kennedy and Johnson administration, and with the agreement of ex-President Eisenhower, the entire establishment at the time, saw this essentially as the Second Korean War being carried out by North Vietnam, as indeed it was. We discovered after 1975, because the insurgency in the South was sponsored and not completely, but largely controlled by the North the entire time. And so the goal was to fight sort of a rerun of the Korean War, where you're fighting infiltrated North Vietnamese soldiers and local guerrillas instead of an invading army, which came later in the 70s. But to avoid bringing in Chinese troops directly. So I reject this conception that I don't think that now, after the end of the Cold War, when we see the whole pattern, we can say Korea was not a war of choice, but Vietnam was. I see this, and this is another debate. From the historian's perspective, there were three great, bloody, devastating proxy wars between the blocs in the course of the Cold War. One was Korea, the other was Indochina, and the third was Afghanistan. And the Soviets did not see Afghanistan as a war of choice. They saw that as something they had to do, and in the same way. So we can disagree, but that's another debate.
Yeah, we should. That's a whole other panel discussion.
Not right now.
Let me go with Dave Rickers first, and then we'll get you over here, sir. Go ahead, Dave. Let me keep a microphone up there. Thanks.
David Rickers at the Cato Institute with Chris, and a former Special Forces officer who served in Afghanistan. I think you have a lot of agreement in this room on what we're saying here, but I think that it's not boiled down to language that's easily politically useful. So my question is on narrative regarding the left and the right, mission creep, and what I'll call ungoverned spaces. I agree with Chris's criteria, tight criteria for deployment, but there's an inevitable expansion of the mission that seems to always happen, and a changing of the military mission. And I'd cite the one-year promise in Bosnia and what we're doing in Afghanistan. So the root of this from the left is the indispensable nation crowd, and from the right, particularly in the military, what we're calling ungoverned spaces, under the theory that ungoverned spaces breed terrorists who will come here and attack us. Mm-hmm. So I don't see any counter to this in Congress. The F-22 is a plane made of pork, and we just fought this battle over that. I don't see any sensible language there. I don't see any executive because, as we said, the Democrat can't be seen as weak, and the Republicans changed after 9/11. So what language from the left and the right, which defies the Cato vision of more than two poles in the political universe, but from the left and the right, what persuades people, voters, to change their ideas, what they expect of their politicians? Because the indispensable nation is winning over the peace and the anti-war crowd, and I would say that an unacceptable answer is let's double special forces. Right. And from the right, the ungoverned spaces has beaten out the we don't want to be the world's policeman crowd. So what do we say?
Well, first of all, on the ungoverned spaces, there's an awful lot on the left as well who believe in dealing with ungoverned spaces for the same reasons that people on the right do. So again, I think the left-right dichotomy is really broken down. But I think the narrative, I like Michael's narrative, which is that this is unsustainable. Maybe, again, not in the technical sense of the term, because we have in the past been able to sustain a level of defense expenditures far higher than we are doing right now, but that it is unrealistic to think that is going to continue. And the narrative is we can, as I tried to lay forth, we can choose a different approach, or we can have it forced on us. It's not going to be forced on us by the outside, not in the kind of classic realist balancing way. But I also don't think it will necessarily be forced on us, or if it is, the choices will be very poor. So we will be forced to make very dramatic cuts in the military, but at a time when the strategy has not been updated to account for that. And that's the point that I'd like to make, is we need to differentiate between what is and what ought, right? It is a fair criticism of my book and of my theory that today, July 24th, 2009, it is unrealistic to expect the neighbors to do it, although I'll point out that we're neighbors too, and we have a neighborhood too. But it is unrealistic, but we should be moving in the direction, starting the move in the direction where there is a greater expectation that others will do more. Not that they can do it immediately, but we have to get to that point. And if we start that process now, maybe we can do it before very draconian cuts are forced on the military at a time when the overarching strategy hasn't been updated. That's what I'd like to see happen.
Just add one point to that. I think you make an important point, and Gordon makes this point too. The politics of this are extremely important, and the simple reality is that we often, those of us more on the left side of the spectrum, tend to blame the sort of neoconservatives for what's happened. But the reality is that both parties are to blame in a lot of respects. The liberal interventionists of the 1990s, many of whom supported the Iraq War, right. These groups work in concert. Actually, I'm very pleased that Chris and I, being a libertarian think tank and a sort of more, well, we're nonpartisan think tank, but
yes, we get it.
Yeah, exactly. are joining together to talk about this issue. The problem is the politics of it. And I have to say, and not to sound a two-partisan note here, this has to come, and I think in large measure, from the Democratic Party, because Republicans, I think, are going to continue to see political benefit out of playing the national security card. I mean, they after all, I would argue, won the 2004 election primarily almost exclusively on that card, that and cultural
But they lost
issues.
the 2006 election.
They lost 2006
by trying to play that card,
Absolutely.
and it failed abysmally.
Well, they did play it again in 2008, so I'm not
Right.
sure they figured out the lesson that doesn't really work so much anymore.
Right.
The problem for Democrats is they haven't figured the lesson out either,
Right.
and they keep thinking if we look soft, if we don't look strong enough, we're going to get hit back by the Republicans. You saw this in the F-22 debate to some extent also, although amazingly it did actually get rejected. It's sort of amazing to happen in Washington. But I think this is going to start with, frankly, Barack Obama changing, as he said, the mindset. But that's not going to happen overnight, because if you look at what he's doing right now, you're seeing an open-ended policy in Afghanistan, and I think his priority is domestic affairs. So I think that's where it has to come from, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. Yeah.
Thank you. Masood Aziz, actually former diplomat from Afghanistan, so I'll speak about this debate in the context of Afghanistan. I think certainly our U.S. military infrastructure has changed now towards more of counterinsurgency involvements, which is a different debate, and this is a really new debate because it defines it under something that is less fighting. Mm-hmm. Certainly, so I think that's one thing that was missing in this debate as to where would that go. Certainly there would be cost involved in it. But I think that if we're talking about foreign policy, certainly the issue here is what instruments of power reflects best American core values around the world. And certainly you can argue that cannot really be a humongous military power. And if that's the argument, and your argument in your book about reducing such a cost, certainly you have to, and I think Gordon Adams alluded at that, is that what then can replace that? Certainly civilians going around the world. But I would also argue that we don't have institutions of any strength at all. If you think about the State Department, USID, have no measurable, comparable strength today. We probably lost a whole generation. So even if you start allocating certain dollars to that, it's going to take us a long time. And perhaps in the context of Afghanistan, there was a story a young doctor went to a very remote village in the mountains a couple of years ago and distributed some medication to this village. You know, there's no roads. And as he's distributing the medication, an old man shows up and asks him, do you know Dr. Jack? And he knows, no, I don't. And he says, certainly you should know Dr. Jack. And after half an hour of translation, this young doctor figured out that Dr. Jack came in 60 years ago in this village via the Peace Corps program. And this old man made sure that everybody, the two generations in this village, understood who Dr. Jack was and what he did. And, of course, the Peace Corps cost, compared to what we're talking about, is almost nothing. But the benefits are huge. The larger debate, in my opinion, is the fact that really the instruments of power that should reflect American values, perhaps we don't need institutions and we don't need large expenses. You know, I think it was Woodrow Wilson that said that the best foreign policy was the Civil Rights Act.
Right.
And so therefore, perhaps reducing certain costs, let American values stand on its own, which is really the real issue.
Right. So that's precisely what I'm saying, and I do think, just to draw out, I mean, clearly there are some differences here about what is the purpose, not just of the purpose of U.S. military power, but the purpose of U.S. national power, defined as the government, and U.S. power, which is not just the government, but which is all of us, okay, all citizens. So, I mean, let's be honest here. Our military is deployed, you know, 4 corners of the globe. Count the number of installations, hundreds of installations, all over the world. They are a touch point for the United States for many people, and the men and women in our military do a fine job of it. And they've adapted in ways that, you know, again, demonstrating time and time again, they can adapt to these non-kinetic, population-centric counterinsurgency. We know the buzzwords. We understand that. But we should not forget that there are millions of other Americans interacting with the world on a daily basis, not in the employ of the U.S. military or the federal government. And that's part of our values as well, right? And so what I'm talking about is making space, sure, for some of what Gordon is talking about in terms of civilian capacity, but not assuming that that civilian capacity has to come in the form of a USAID or a Peace Corps. Why can it not be an NGO like Doctors Without Borders or you know, an aid group, another aid group, doing the same thing, usually, I'll say, more efficiently? So,
add a thought to that, because I don't really fully disagree with it either. Just a little bit. But your question made me step back a little bit and say, what's our theory of change here? Because whether you're Hegelian or a Marxist, there is a dialectic to history, which means that when you get reactions when you do things, and the reactions cause other things to happen. And I would say right now, historically, one of the things that's happened is by virtue of the over-militarization of U.S. global engagement, all those bases, that adaptation of forces to a counterinsurgency mode, the invasion of Iraq, sorry, we did choose it.
Agree with that.
Right?
He agrees with that.
He agrees with that one, right? You know, all of those things set in motion reactions. And I don't think that necessarily the only reaction is some of the great power balances of the United States. That's a particular model of saying what a reaction is. But some of that reaction, I believe at this point in time, is a reduced willingness to consider the United States as the vector of your security in other countries. Not sure I want those guys around. They tend to crash into things and destroy a lot of stuff. And I'm not sure that's good for me. So I'm wondering, I'm just raising the question, as to whether by acting the way we have acted, we have set in motion other processes that undermine the future effectiveness of that very form of action by the United States. And I think that's where our so-called counterinsurgency strategy is going to go eventually. It's not going to be a welcome strategy in a lot of countries in the world. But we are building a huge capability to do it when it may not be particularly welcome. So from my perspective, the downside of having this militarized capacity is you give the military I don't disagree with Chris that a lot of people in the military have done some wonderful adaptations here, but this is not a natural core mission for the military. And they do not do it particularly well. Right? Governing democracies is not something that militaries, ours or anybody else's, does particularly well. It sets in motion a process, first at home, that is to say, we further disempower the other tools of American statecraft because we rely on the military to support functions that we ought to be providing for better capabilities on the civilian side of the government. Let's not go too far down that road, you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. And we have put an increasingly uniformed face on America's global engagement, which is counterproductive to our national security interests.
Yeah, this reminds me of something that an Air Force general said to me in referring to the military. The irony of using the least democratic institution in American society to spread democracy around the world. Let me just take a bunch of questions, and then we will. Do you want to make one point? I'll take a bunch of questions, then we'll just do a final thing. Patrick, you had one, and right here as well. Okay.
Great, thanks. I'm Patrick Doherty. I'm the Deputy Director at the American Strategy Program here at New America, and I want to thank Michael Cohen for standing this up. And promise the crowd, everybody watching, that we're going to be doing a lot more of this and really trying to make sure we do have this debate in Washington, and we're going to try to have it right on the stage. So thank you, Michael, for doing this. Thanks, Chris, for writing the book. What I'd like to do is kind of ask the question that Michael Lind implied in his remarks, but we haven't really addressed yet, and it's taking the question back to purpose. And if Michael left off by saying, we have this strategy of dual containment that was both the strategy for the Cold War and then was just extended for the last 20 years. And it had two components to it. It had a security component and an economic component. What is the new purpose for any new grand strategy that the rest of the panel is looking at? What really is that purpose? Containment was really ultimately about how are we going to defeat the Soviet threat? Do we have a singular purpose out there, or are we more like a lot of kind of the current commentators that say, the world is complex. There are a lot of different issues that we need to deal serially with, or in parallel, actually, with. So do we have a singular purpose that can give us some grand strategic guidance? And then is this at the level where we're talking about crafting a grand strategy in which our economy has to do the heavy lifting once again? Because I would argue that dual containment was conditioned upon our ability to let the American economy do the strategic heavy lifting. And containment was about making sure that hot war didn't break out. Are we talking about that level of strategy for this next era? And if so, what's the purpose?
Let's just, we're here.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. Mitzi Worth, I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I want to ask about some things that are slightly on the side of this. First of all, I don't think this is a nation that talks about governance. We talk about winning. And in fact, as soon as Obama won the election, AU ran a 2-week seminar on how to win the next election. Nobody's been talking about how do we govern. I mean, I think that's a real issue. David, is that your name? I think his point about language and explaining the story so the rest of us can understand it on national security is parallel to the issues that are now going on in the whole health debate. I mean, we can't understand the details of that. We can't make smart choices. And I think we are caught up in the language of people who've looked at the world through a rearview mirror. I don't think we have enough people who think about what should we be anticipating and what are the consequences of these various choices that we make. I have sort of a mantra that I have on my business card which says culture, context, connections, causes, choices, consequences. I've spent the last 32 years connected with the Defense Department. My view is that they look at everything in terms of a one-off solution. In this complex, interdependent world we live in today, that ain't going to cut it.
Patrick, to your question, I hope this doesn't sound trite, but the purpose of our power, the purpose of our military power, is the same, or at least it should be the same, as the purpose of every other country's military power, which is to defend their national security, first and foremost, okay? Now, I hope that... okay, yes, I will. Right, because my argument, I don't think this is all that controversial, my argument that is it would be a good thing for the United States if other countries behaved in that way, if we treated them as though they would and should behave in that way. No, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it can happen over time. And the grand strategy is away from hegemony, which is clearly articulated, repeated over and over again, away from a view of the world and a very skeptical and fearful view of power held by others, to a more accepting and tolerant view of power held by others, because ultimately, because I do think that it is fair, which is an overused word, an imprecise word, but I also ultimately think it'll work out better, because the simple fact is the world is complex, and problems that we deal with and feel compelled to deal with as necessary wars will be wars of choice for other people. They will have their own necessary wars, and that's we've lost track of our ability to define necessary wars, I would argue, precisely because we deal with every single potential conflict everywhere in the world as ours and ours first and foremost, and if others come along after us, all the better. I think we need to turn that around. And so that's the grand strategy. Turn that literally upside down.
Reshaping the international security order?
Yes, power held by others is something to be welcomed, not feared. And that is exactly the opposite of our mentality for the last close to 20 years. And I think it is unsustainable. I think it is unrealistic that can persist.
I just add to that. I don't disagree with a lot of that. I would add to it, though, that I think the nation-state paradigm, while real, is inadequate to answer what we require in the way of a grand strategy. And that the interdependence of this world and the requirement for some multilateral ways to address issues that are by and large non-kinetic issues, but nonetheless can in the end pose kinetic dilemmas for neighbors or for regions, is the central dilemma that we're going to have to deal with. So it's redefining the international system. I don't have any quarrel with power sharing. It's only that dimension that I would add to it, which is, as I would say, largely, for my mind, a civilian set of dilemmas and a civilian capacity building issue with a relatively subordinate military capacity and a support function.
Well, as you can imagine from my earlier remarks, I think that if you get the great powers to get along, then you've pretty much solved your problem. And if the great powers don't get along, then you're screwed. Our goals, and I think libertarians, paleo-conservatives, Americans want a world where we don't have to be armed to the teeth, and where we can trade, and there's a fair amount of economic liberalism and interchange. You can't have that in a world of warring great powers, even if they're just fighting cold wars, because that will destroy your world economy too. You'll have to militarize your economy, and you have trading embargoes and things like that. So the way the U.S. has tried to avert this since the Korean War is to have a unilateral offer of security to the other great powers and a unilateral offer of market access, whether or not they play by free market rules. That worked for Germany and West Germany and Japan when they were recovering from World War II. China, India in the future, and the European Union are just too big. That can't work anymore. So what we need is just to go from this unilateral system of the patron and the clients to a more traditional international or interbloc system in the case of the EU, where I've just used the term concert of power, which was used by the Wilson and Roosevelt administrations. You have a concert of power to avoid great power war, and you have trade agreements through the WTO or bilaterally or minilaterally among China, East Asia, India, European Union, North America, to have a more or less reasonable trading system. But it has to be based, and I think here I agree with Chris, and I assume with Michael and Gordon, it can't be unilateral forever. it will for the near future, but ultimately it should be bilateral with mutual security and trade obligations on both sides.
I'll just would finish up here by saying, to Patrick's point, to some extent, the first means of getting past an addiction is you have to recognize you have a problem, and I think that's actually part of what we're trying to do here today is that sort of intervention, if you will, not military, but an intervention. And I would actually argue, to some extent, part of the problem here is that we don't recognize that we do a very poor job of recognizing what our national interests actually are, that we define them in the broadest possible terms, and we don't recognize, and this is regarding the point, that there are limitations on what the U.S. can and cannot do, a point that I think the last 8 years of our foreign policy has driven home pretty clearly. I want to thank Michael and Gordon and Chris for coming. I want to recommend buying Chris's book, which is on sale over here. Pick up my article on the Powell Doctrine.
Which is free.
Which is free. Read Michael's book, American Way of Strategy. Read Gordon's blog at budgetinsight.wordpress.com. I think it's great, his Citizen Center blog. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.